Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, very good. Well, I'm excited to be here. I got up this way once about 10 years ago and made it to the parking lot, and we were headed to Erie, and it was getting late in the day, so I didn't get to come and see all the cool stuff that's here. So I'm excited to be up here and visit the area. So I wanted to start off by just giving a little where's St. Francis University. If you don't know, because that often becomes a question, we are about 2.5 hours away in Loretto, between Johnstown and Altoona. The school was founded in 1847, so it's got a pretty long history. It's the oldest Franciscan university in the country. We've got schools of business, health science, and education, and STEAM. So the STEAM school is science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, and that's the school that I'm based in. We also have a Division I athletic program, so if you're into basketball, you may have recently seen our men's and women's programs were both in the Northeast Conference Championships on some of the ESPN channels, and the men's team actually made it to the NIT, so it's pretty cool to see them on national television. My outreach center that I specifically work for, the Institute for Energy, we've been around since 2005. We serve all of Pennsylvania and do various outreach activities. We do site assessments for farms and small businesses and homes, various renewable energy sources as well as energy efficiency. We do some energy research, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've done as we move through this. We do tours, education, presentations like tonight, and we also we also go into the classroom. So these are some model wind turbines. These ones here, they can lift weights. We also have ones that can generate electricity, and the students can experiment with various things, and it's a pretty exciting little program. And then a couple of years ago, my boss got this idea to build a tiny house, put solar panels on the roof, and take it around and show people how the energy technology works. And at first I was like, this is a crazy idea. But lo and behold, we've made it possible thanks to a lot of support. And so inside we have a biomass pellet stove for heating, wood heating. The solar panels charge batteries. So on the inside we have everything electric runs off of that. We also have a small wind turbine blade, which I have up here. We have some wall insulation demonstrations and various sustainable features like bamboo flooring, locally sourced wood, and different things. And we've taken it all over the state, so we're out on the road. Hopefully someday we'll get up this direction. We were over to Clear Creek and Parker Dam State Park last year. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about just what is wind, how it's been used historically, as well as the present state of wind, what the future looks like for the technology, how a wind farm is constructed, pros and cons of that, and take any of your questions. So wind, of course, simply is just the movement of air. And you could go back and say that it's solar energy in some respects because the sun doesn't heat everywhere the same. There are places where it's warmer, places where it's cooler, particularly say at nighttime and daytime. But the heating actually causes differences in pressure, and that creates the wind. If we go back in time, sailing, of course, was very important for exploration of the world. So wind from a transportation standpoint has been used for a long time. Over in Europe, of course, we had the windmills for pumping water, grinding grain. So this technology has been used for a long time. In the United States, the first instance of wind is probably at the Flower Dew 100 plantation down in Virginia in 1621. And this is a replica of it. It since was moved to a museum in Texas, but you can see that model there. And so the one technology there is grinding grain. And in the 1760s, on Windmill Island, off of in the river there at Philadelphia, there was actually a windmill, and you can see a sketch of that. So kind of a cool, close to home historic use. In the 1850s, middle of the 1850s, the Halliday self-governing windmill was developed. And so this was really useful in that people didn't have to necessarily stand beside the windmill to control it. It could now control itself. And this helped to, in some respects, settle the West, because you can now have water pumping for cattle if they're out in the field. You don't have to stand there all day and control it. So another technology is pumping water. And then in 1888, Charles Brush developed this wind generator, and this was in Cleveland. He actually powered his house with this. He had a lot of batteries and lit up the lights of his home with this electricity generator. And what I think is really neat, to get a scale size here, you can see this little guy down here mowing the lawn. So it was quite a machine. In the 1890s, steel blades were developed. This was a useful, more durable material. So we had, thousands and thousands and thousands of these across the landscape. Here in Pennsylvania, when I was doing my undergrad history capstone project, the idea was pitched out to look at the history of wind in Pennsylvania. And I was like, I didn't realize, that I never really thought about wind being used here in Pennsylvania back in the old days. But from the mid-1800s through the 1920s, there were about a dozen manufacturers at different times that produced windmills here in the state. And some of those examples, names: Bosman, Kennedy, Strong, Enterprise, and Paragon. And the Bosman was particularly interesting. It actually was a horizontal axis one, so it'd spin around like this. And I found examples of advertisements of these for sale in some old newspapers. And one of them was even in New Zealand. I found an example. So he had a pretty far reach. At the same time, you can see that he's selling various other supplies, so I concluded that he probably didn't sell these as his lone source of revenue, let's say. It looked like he had a varied business. But he got some patents for this project. Moving forward in time, I interviewed some individuals, oral history, including my grandfather. And until I did this project, I didn't realize that my grandfather had a windmill on the farm, or really thought too much about life prior to having electricity and hand pumping water and things like that. So he said that the windmill on the family farm was about 30 feet high, made of angle iron. There was a wooden platform up there, and his brother would climb up and grease it. And so pretty interesting story there. He said that you had to do it on a calm day, because even when it was turned off, it would act like a wind vane. It would push you off the platform if you weren't careful. Another gentleman I interviewed, Jerry Sharp, and so these individuals are down in south central Pennsylvania, near the university. He remembered a windmill, or a wind turbine. This one was generating electricity at his grandparents. And his grandparents lived on top of a coal mine. His grandfather worked in the coal mine, but they were heating the home with kerosene, and they had this windmill for electricity. He said that they cut a tree off, put the turbine on top of that, and the blades, he said, somewhere around 2 feet, or 4 feet along, and 4 feet, 2 feet apiece, and it didn't take much wind to move it. Yeah. So, and then they had wires running into the house. And so I had he drew a sketch of kind of what he recalled that to look like. And so they had batteries that this was charging. And he said that there were no 6-volt light bulbs, so they took the headlights out of a car, and they had 2 of them. That was their light. And he said, I used to sit there, and the lights would keep getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until they ran out of power from the batteries. So it was an interesting story there as well. He also told me that his grandmother made sure that they weren't climbing up this, because she said she didn't want to have to carry them off to the doctor. Which apparently is a pretty common thing for little ones from stories I've read, the temptation to climb up these machines. Another gentleman told me about the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. And this really changed things because now, instead of generating your own power on site, we have these rural locations having electricity delivered to them through the power lines. And this changed things. In this instance here, in many cases, the windmills were taken down when the power got to the home. And so this kind of eliminated them from the landscape. But we jump ahead now, and there's kind of this second renaissance, I may say, of wind. So it's not, it kind of looks like it's this new technology, and indeed it's bigger. We've got these large turbines now, but at the same time, it's something that has been used for a long time. Here in Pennsylvania, the first wind farm was constructed in 2000, the Green Mountain Wind Farm down in Somerset County. A trivia question for you. What percentage of Pennsylvania's electricity comes from wind? 2%, 6%, 12%, or 45%? This is approximate. Any guesses? So the first ones I heard, 2%, you guys were right. So here's wind in, this is all our energy sources in 2001. In 2001, anybody tell me what the biggest source of electricity was? Coal, yeah, coal's number one, nuclear second there. Those are our main sources, very small portions of anything else. Wind was less than 1%. Jump ahead to 2017, what other source do we now have? Yeah, gas has moved in here, and it's actually our second largest. At the moment, nuclear remains the largest, but coal's share has really declined as gas has risen. And you can see there, wind is around 1.5%, 2%, somewhere in that range. Still very tiny. If we look at the United States, wind is a larger source overall. We've got a kind of a different energy mix on a national scale, wind being about 6.3% in recent years. And when we look at the generation sources, we've got these sources of generation over here on the left. So this can be things like wind, coal, natural gas. And these are part of the grid. So the grid system is where we get our electricity. When I go into schools, a lot of times they'll say, where's the electricity come from? And they'll say, well, the switch on the wall. And it's like, so we try to trace this backwards because it's, it's not just generated there in the wall. So we got the sources of transmission and then the distribution. So it goes out to homes and businesses. And we can't really necessarily track that a certain electron flowed from the wind turbine to here or our house. It kind of all goes together. So unless you got a wire specifically running from one to the other, it kind of just all mixes together, and that's how that operates. So how many wind turbines are in Pennsylvania? Any guesses there?
C.
So it's B, 726. So as of my most recent calculation, there are 25 wind farms in the state. There are 726 wind turbines, and that comes to about 1,369 megawatts. And a megawatt is somewhere, could power around 300 to 500 homes. So an average, a two megawatt wind turbine, I'm sorry. So that's a typical size of the turbines here in Pennsylvania, about 2 megawatt machine. So you're thinking 300 to 500 per turbine. Of recent news, there is one farm under construction in Potter County. And Microsoft is going to be purchasing the power from that. It's currently under construction, should be done sometime this year. And there are 25 turbines. When we're looking at the winds and trying to figure out where may be a good location to place a turbine, the resource is, of course, the most important thing, looking at how fast the wind is on an annual basis, because it fluctuates over the course of the year. So we try to get an average. And if we looked at the United States as a whole, the Midwest is a great resource out there, very strong winds. It can just blow over the plains there. Here in Pennsylvania, we've still got some good resources, particularly on the mountains. So if we zoomed in closer, these blue areas are the the top of the ridges primarily. They're the best locations, the strongest winds, as well as Lake Erie. And there's a great resource there, of course. If we were to plot out then where the turbines are, you can see that they correlate pretty well to those locations. The only exception is Turkey Hill. If you eat Turkey Hill ice cream, they actually have 2 turbines down there that help to power the ice cream plant. So they're kind of off the chart there, and I was surprised that they found a good resource, but there's one down there. Up here, we haven't had any development, partly from community, maybe opposition, partly from migratory birds and bats, as well as airport issues. So there could be development up there, but there are also some things that hasn't seen any development in Erie to this point. And the wind farm that's under construction is going to be in that area. If you are interested in looking at the resource for your location, we have maps on our website. This is Venango County. Not a very good resource here. If I zoom it up to, that was 30-meter hub height. At 100 meters high, so this would be where you'd start to consider a commercial scale turbine. We've got some resource, but it's not that great. We'd be looking for blue on the map, and there isn't any there. In general, you'd want about a 10 mile per hour wind speed for small winds and a 14.5 mile per hour speed for a larger turbine. And the higher up you go, the faster the wind speed. You can also go to our website and click on our Wind Explorer. We have Google Map interface, and you can actually click around any location in the state, and it'll give you pretty detailed information of what the predicted computerized models would say for your site. So I've done this here for the museum where we're located, and it came out to be somewhere in the, what is this here? I think it's 6.5 miles per hour. Not very good. I wouldn't recommend putting a wind turbine here on a small scale. And then on a larger scale, it's also not very great. Another thing you can see is the windrows here. The wind's primarily coming out of the west and the south. And the winter months, we're starting here in January. You can see production would be strong there. Goes down a bit in the summer months and then comes back up in November, December. Small wind is pretty expensive as well. Average price is $10,000 per kilowatt. So if you wanted to power your house, you'd need about a 10 kW system. That'd be $100,000 potentially. Solar, somewhere around $3,000. So much more economical in the $30,000 range, which is still a lot, but I'd go that way from a financial standpoint. And there's the 100-meter map, which is still not at 10 mile per hour, even at 100 meters up. So if you got any questions about this, feel free to ask me about it. I can help you find this after the presentation. One more trivia question for you then. What does an anemometer measure? Yeah, it's wind speed. And so these can be used, put up on towers. We have towers that we will use. You can see here, this is a little example. And so the university, since the early 2000s, had decided that they were going to do some on-site wind assessments. And so they'd put up towers about 200 feet tall and measure at various sites across the state. There's one turbine up here in Erie County. Most of them were in the south central region near the campus. But the data collection from this actually resulted in 4 of the wind farms in the state. So some of the data in those initial studies resulted in actual development. And what was unique about this program, rather than having a developer come to somebody's land and say, hey, I want to rent this, this allowed a landowner to say, what is my resource and can I go get it developed? And so it's kind of a unique program. Now, when we're talking about wind, there are certainly some good things and some bad things. One of the things that often is discussed is the impact on the environment, birds being one of those things. There's not a significant impact. I don't want to downplay it. But when it comes to birds flying in the turbines, we have about 4 per year that are killed here in Pennsylvania, according to the Game Commission in various studies. Most of those are songbirds. Some raptors may be impacted as well, but mostly songbirds. The bigger concern is actually bats. And with white nose syndrome, if you're familiar with that, we've had a lot of devastation in the population from that fungal disease. And then wind turbines kill an average of 27 per year. So that's more of the concern because we don't know what the population of bats are to begin with. And so what effect that's having on the population is really hard to determine. There are some things that have been tested, like turning the turbines off until the wind is stronger. Bats like to fly when there's low wind speed. And of course, you make more electricity when there's high wind speed. So if they just turn them off when the wind speeds are lower, they've seen significant reduction in fatalities. And they know kind of the migratory times when the bats are out flying. So there are things that they're doing that are helping, but still more research needs to be done on this. Another thing is to consider land use. So here, I grabbed this screenshot. These turbines here were placed on stripped coal mine area, whereas these ones were out in, you can see the forest there. So depending on where you place them, you can have an impact, maybe forest fragmentation. These turbines here were placed in farm field. You can see there's actually a really big tractor down here, but it's really, really small compared to the really giant turbines. When we look at the benefits, air quality is certainly something that they can be beneficial for. If we looked at Pittsburgh back in the 1950s, a lot of smog, a lot of industry, a lot of pollution there. And if we looked at the air today, it'd say, yeah, it looks a lot better, but we still actually have fairly poor air quality in western Pennsylvania. And particulate matter, these dust and soot and things, very small pieces, smaller than sand, smaller than hair, can get into your lungs and be bad for breathing. And if we look at locations here, these darker, these darker areas here, these red areas, are places where there's higher levels of that, and you can see a lot of that in our region. Another thing is CO2 reduction, so reducing our carbon footprint. The Drawdown project made this list of various things that could potentially reduce our carbon footprint. And the second highest thing that they rated here was onshore wind. So this has one of the biggest potentials to reduce our carbon footprint with current technology. And there's various other things on here. The yellow ones are different types of solar. But that project's out there. There's an interesting book that goes with that. Something that you may not think about is actually impact on water quality. And so with burning fossil fuels, we're putting more CO2 into the air, and this is making the water more acidic. And so that can actually have an impact on critters that are making shells. And so they can have a harder time making the shells. And so it's affecting the environment. And if we looked at a mine site here, this is down near the university. We've got this place that's acres that looks like kind of Martian habitat. And this is from a borehole, the acid mine drainage coming up. And so this has ruined the landscape. Nothing is really growing there. So this is an impact that could potentially be avoided by potentially going with some wind. Another consideration is where we're placing the turbines. A couple years ago at the Institute, we did a study and looked at where the best resource was. And then we looked at areas that were public versus private. So state game lands, state parks, state forests. And it turns out that a lot of the remaining places where there's the best developable wind resource happen to be on these places where there's no development. So when somebody says, oh, let's put a lot of wind turbines in Pennsylvania, we're like, there's maybe not all that much technologically feasible locations to do that. So, the potential here in Pennsylvania may be somewhat limited at this point. Another thing is looking at roads and transmission lines where the electric lines go. And so that's an important consideration in where turbines are placed. And then, of course, you don't want to put them near airports, don't want airplanes flying into them. And a curious one that I find is that they can interfere with radar. And so if you look at this map here, you can see that there's rain up here. You can see these moving parts. But then these areas that I've circled, you'll note that they are stationary. They're not moving. And those are actually wind turbines showing up on the map. So down in my neck of the woods, fairly often I'll see, a clear day, and there's something showing up on the map, and it's like, okay, I know the wind turbines are spinning today. It's not so good, particularly out west, where unless the meteorologists know it, they may think, that if there's a tornado or something, that's something that they definitely have to consider. And then one more thing is the proximity to buildings. Some people may find wind turbines to be really appealing to look at, others not so much, as well as the sound. They do make a whooshing sound when they're spinning, and in certain conditions make that louder or softer, as well as having a shadow flicker. And so you can see light, dark, depending on where you're located. And then occasionally they happen to catch fire. So one of the ones near my house, actually, I got to see this one that caught on fire. So these things do happen, but when you have them, say a couple thousand feet from any homes, and that's part of most regulations, you don't have any concerns with, as long as the people clear out of the way, it just kind of burns itself out. That's the typical process. One of the benefits to having that cleared area then is that nothing else can be built in that area, and so that habitat is then left for either farming or the forest stays, so you're not going to see any more development. So in some respects, it can help protect environmental space. I do want to say, every energy source has a consequence unless we don't use it, so that's something to certainly consider. And for a long time, I think wind was approached from an environmental standpoint. Okay, this is something green, let's do it. But curiously now, the cost of energy has come down so much for wind that it's one of the cheapest energy sources. So you see a lot of companies like Google, like Amazon, like Home Depot investing in this resource. Lazards, who does a yearly study, they look at all the different energy sources and they compare them. And so wind actually turned out to be, this is a range, so you can see a range here, cheapest to expensive in megawatt hours. Wind turned out to be the cheapest one here. Solar on a very large scale in certain areas can be very cheap. And then on the non-renewable side, natural gas is certainly in that same area, but coal, nuclear, really struggling at this point to compete on an economic standpoint. So when we look at a turbine, we've got some different parts. We've got the blades, which are the things that are spinning. Oops. We've got the nacelle, that's the thing up at the top. And then we got the tower, and that's what gets it up so high. So these bigger blades are able to capture more wind and able to generate more electricity. These are some pictures of the Patton wind farm. This is actually probably the closest wind farm to you in Pennsylvania, and it's about 10 miles from our campus. The data from this project, that got this project going, actually started from the Institute. And so these are some pictures of the process. You can see there the mud being moved around. And then they pour down a base. You can see the ATV there for some scale. Here's Marty. He was kind of the lead landowner on the project and all the steel that goes into that. Here's the crane. These cranes are ginormous. They can cost $20,000 a day to bring in. They bring them in on multiple trucks because they're too large to move around all at one piece. And so they are quite expensive to operate and quite large. Here's the electrical system. So there's a new substation built so all that electricity can be then connected to the grid and distributed out to homes. This picture to me always reminds me kind of like a little toy set, but it's very, very large in reality. You can see here the nacelle. This here is where the gearbox is. This will be set up on top of the tower. And that's about the size of a small school bus. So it's very large. Here's the blades. And these can be 120, 140 feet long. They're brought in by trucks. One of the limiting factors to making them larger is they can't transport them. So that has, in some cases, prohibited the larger turbines from being built. Here's the field as the turbines are going up, and there's the completed project. So you can see them there. If we looked at the electricity production over time, this is since the project began, and you can see that there's these ups and downs, which highly correlates to the seasons. So in the wintertime, we've got a lot of wind resource. In the summertime, not so much. So something like solar, which is also a variable resource, summertime would be a great time to produce solar, not so great in winter. So these two actually would balance themselves out fairly well. Here's the view looking up towards the turbine from the bottom. And here's the view from inside. So inside, there's usually a ladder people climb up. They can get to the top. The technicians will work on the machines. There also, in some cases, maybe an elevator that can help lift up tolls. And you can see here there's conduit, and that's all the electricity and stuff running down through it. The director of the Institute, my boss, used to work on these. So she would climb up them. She's been up a lot of them. She's got some interesting stories, including being up tower during the earthquake that struck in 2011 here in Pennsylvania. And it started to shake on a calm day. And they're like, did it just start the wind blowing or what? So they're like, get down now. So they were fine, but it made for an interesting story. If we were to look inside, at least from a cartoon drawing there, the shaft spins around and runs a generator. And so it'll spin around. And so we can generate electricity. We take these into the classroom, light up a light. And And so inside there, we have magnets and coils of wire. And oh, now it's not going to work. There we go. So we can light up the little lights. So we show the students, this is really a rather simple process. We got some magnets inside, some coils of wire around it, and we're able to produce electricity. And this works the same on a larger scale. It might be a little bit different setup, but it's a pretty similar process if it's wind. If it's coal, in a coal plant, it's just using the steam to spin the turbine. So it's the same process. In this, we're just using the wind to spin the generator and make electricity. There we go. And then the view from the top. Here we have, my boss took this as a picture of the instruments on the back, and they help to turn the turbine into the right direction and keep it oriented so that the turbine gets the most electricity possible, so or the best wind resource to make the most electricity possible. So it's mechanically moving around. We did a survey a couple years ago and interviewed various schools, universities, and business organizations. What's the next big thing in energy? And what we were told, the number one thing is energy storage, so batteries. And batteries are probably a great answer to bringing more wind, more solar online, because when the wind's not blowing, the sun is not shining, can't use them, this is a way to save that energy. So energy storage has a lot of potential. Electric vehicles as well have a lot of potential. These words, based on how big they are, how often they appeared, were kind of the things that we're told, may be important to the future of energy. When we look at other places we might put turbines, this is in Rhode Island, the Block Island Wind Farm. And so there are 5 turbines of 6 megawatts each. So the farm that I showed you the construction of was 15 wind turbines at 2 megawatts apiece. So this is a 30 megawatt project. The project I showed you was a 30 megawatt project, but 5 turbines compared to 15. So you can see the larger turbine able to make a lot more power, but these are in the water. It's the first offshore wind farm in the United States. They've been doing this in Europe for 30 years or so, but this is something that's up and coming. Potentially the next one developed in the United States could be off of Lake Erie. So Cleveland, there's a project, they may come online in say 2020, 2021, the Icebreaker Wind Project, and it's a 6 turbine project that is currently, looks like it's moving towards development. And here's the view from the top looking out over it. And at this point, when I'm talking to students, I'm like, who wants to climb up this? Anybody, is this the job for you or you want to stay on the ground? And there's actually a lot of demand for this. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the United States government statistics, showed that solar installer #1, fastest growing job wind turbine technician number 2. So there's a lot of potential in this field. If anybody's interested, there's a program, or you know anybody who might be interested, Energy Path. The Sustainable Energy Fund over in Allentown has this wonderful conference every year. They're not doing small wind. Some years they'll do small wind. You learn how to put a wind turbine up. They're doing Intro to Sustainable Energy, biomass, hands-on solar installations, policy and regulations. So if you're interested in that, check it out. So I want to thank the organizers and everybody who has allowed me to come. I would thank you for your attention. Up here, we have, I have a small wind turbine blade. Feel free to check it out. A couple flyers over there. If you got any questions, then feel free to let me know.
I'm on the way to Niagara Falls. I don't know if it's on a lake or not, but I've seen a number of, I've gone by there 3 times and never heard of moving. When they're shut down, are the blades locked? Or?
Yeah, they can be locked into position. So if the technicians are up there, they'll want to lock them into place. And you can a lot of times tell that I think one of them will kind of position itself. I think it'll look like this. And so one will be locked in place with the tower. And so how they can control to some degree how the turbine is spinning or not spinning as much, the blades will actually turn. So these can turn and pitch, and so they'll pitch out of the wind, and that will help to avoid the wind spinning them. Yeah, so turbines may not be spinning because they have maintenance going on. They might not be spinning because of low wind speeds. It could be for migratory reasons, you know, birds and bats flying through, and they've stopped them for that. It could be that there's a low demand for power, so they don't need the electricity. They can turn them off for that. So there's various reasons why they might not be spinning.
If there's a sudden surge and airflow, will it have an automatic kick on and off? Or?
They can be controlled pretty easily, so there's pretty much a button you can turn them on, turn them off. As long as the wind is there, they will start up, but they can't operate usually somewhere around 55 mile per hour or above. If they get spinning, there's too much wind, it can actually damage them, which kind of seems counterintuitive, like, you know, but they can be damaged. So there's a kind of a shut-off limit.
So someone has to be there at all times?
No, they can be controlled manually from a computer from pretty much anywhere. Yeah, you can pull, I think I've heard that you can like have it on your phone and like, oh, okay, there, let's turn them off or turn them on. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Expectancy of the tower and once it's erected.
Yeah, so somewhere around 20 to 25 years is general life expectancy. My boss actually studied that as her master's thesis. And she was looking at the cost of the whole lifespan and what it would take to repower them when we get to that end of the lifespan. And so most people said, okay, well, they'll take them down, put new ones up, the technology has changed. She said the one guy said, they're just gonna cut them down and let them fall. It's like, interesting. But a couple years ago, the first wind farm in the state, and it only made it to 2016. So 16-year lifespan, at least for the first one here in the state. So it's an older technology, you know, some of the newer ones may have newer things. They literally cut them down and left them fall. So you can go out online and find a video of them falling over. They just scrapped them. Now in most cases, when that was a farmland, so they were able to kind of just let them fall. When they're in the forest, I don't think that's gonna happen. I think they'll bring a crane in because they're not gonna knock over a bunch of trees. But so we've seen one wind farm do that. Most of the time, they're just gonna replace them with new technology then at that end of that lifetime.
Is that like if the lifetime does end on it, are the vanes or whatever, do they have to replace too, or can you just do the power supply?
I think they would probably do most of it. I'm not sure about the tower. It would depend on it. And they're actually looking at like doing concrete tower and pouring concrete on site that allows it to be, you know, they can go higher and things. So the technology's changing as to, I would presume that they would probably replace everything. But there's also a used market actually as well. So you can actually go online and buy a used wind turbine, even large ones. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The wind turbines really don't spin that fast compared to your model there. And I noticed from the slide previous that there must be a huge gearbox in front of the generator.
Indeed, yeah. There are maybe 2,000 to 3,000 pieces inside some of those turbines. Depends on the setup. Some of them are direct drive, so you don't have a bunch of gears. But yeah, they can be they need regular maintenance, so they'll get up there. work on them, and they get quite warm as well, so, from all the heat through that process. And your question was, did I answer it?
Yeah, that,
Okay.
in that diagram,
Yes.
kind of
Yes.
huge gearbox.
Yes, very much so.
Generator was,
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, the generator itself, is it DC that makes, I mean, you know, when you have a constant
Right.
generator, you gotta have a 60 cycle that makes 60 cycles, you know? So they must make DC, or then they run a generator to run an AC generator, so you have your constant frequencies, so
Yes.
all your clocks in your house don't change.
I wish my boss were here for this one because she could totally tell you it. I forget if I know the small one it would generate in wound AC, but it was rectified to DC immediately. And then
Well, again, it makes,
I think it was wound AC to begin, so it was pretty, like, it wasn't very clean waves.
Yeah.
Went straight to, I think it was rectified to DC, and then at the inverter where it went into the building went to AC. So I think AC, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up some more. Yeah,
I
yeah.
was gonna build one myself, no.
Well, you could. There are instructions out there to build your own, and you can take classes if you actually wanted to.
Have you ever calculated the tip speed of the blade when it's normal function?
I've been told that they spin somewhere, and it depends on the specific turbine, somewhere around 14 times a minute, and that blade speed out at the end can be somewhere around 200 miles per hour. I haven't, that's not a necessarily, I'm not sure if my source is correct, but that's what I've heard.
I had heard pretty near the speed of sound. That's why I wondered if it was that high.
Yeah, they can get going pretty fast, yeah.
When you store that, each battery stored, right?
In theory, the electricity could be stored, but in most cases, the electricity that we have going on right here was pretty much generated instantaneously at a power plant. So we're not generally storing electricity. Batteries are more for balancing out loads, so if there's a sudden drop off, if a plant went offline, or if the wind turbines got if it got a little less windy or something, they kind of balance it out. But for the most part, the electricity we have here is generated on demand, and the batteries are kind of just backup balancing out at this point.
Your scaler showed quite a bit of fluctuation.
Indeed, which is a reason why it's really beneficial to have various energy sources. You know, a coal plant can function all the time, nuclear can function all the time, and so having various sources can be very beneficial. Yeah.
Better off putting all better sources, multiple sources in the house.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily do it on an individual
Take multiple
scale.
sources off the grid.
It would be stuff you're taking from the grid, yeah. Yeah.
And there's been off and on for several years talk at Lake Erie,
Mhm.
putting them in Lake Erie.
Yes.
Now, I don't know, the ocean works, but Lake Erie freezes over about every 5-6 years. Melting ice chunks is a little rough on the framework.
I think the icebreaker project there in Cleveland will probably demonstrate how feasible it is. But they've been doing it in Europe for a while, and I think some of those are in pretty cold water. So I think these ones will be mounted to the bedrock, but the effects on it, I'm not sure how the technology will be affected by that. But good thought. Yes.
I kind of question putting them in forest land too, if they catch fire.
Indeed, that can be a concern, you know. In the case where I saw the turbine on fire, I had actually heard the call go out for the fire company and followed the fire trucks and kind of found where it was through that. So yeah, the response time could be a factor in whether or not there's a fire, depending on the season and things, yeah. So it's definitely a consideration, yes.
How much turbine manufacturing is happening in Pennsylvania?
So Gamesa, one of the companies, was located down in Fairless Hills near Philadelphia. A lot of the blades that went on the turbines in our area here were made in Cambria County, not too far from the campus. Unfortunately, as the market has dried up, they've moved most of their operation to Mexico. So there's not too much going on a large scale here in Pennsylvania, but there is a decent amount of manufacturing in the United States as a whole. There's somewhere around 105,000 jobs supported by the wind industry last year.
We were traveling from Colorado back to Pennsylvania, and there were thousands of them. Now, what do they do with them? They can't just knock them down. They were close together.
Sure, I think they would bring a crane in and do that. I think that's going to be the general process in most cases. Yeah.
And they were in flat locations. Now, what were they using them for? I mean, they were.
Yeah, so the electricity would just be sent to the grid and then go to a city or wherever it's needed. So just you. One of the challenges is where you don't have a lot of homes, you need to get large transmission lines to be able to get it to homes and businesses. So one of the challenges is if you don't like to look at turbines, if you don't like to look at power lines are also needed in this process. So the electricity is just be shipped off to wherever it's needed. You know, the east and west coast have a lot of people, so probably headed those directions. But in general, the electricity is used close to where it's generated. It's just if you do see that like a company like Microsoft is buying the power, they might be getting the credits, kind of the financial benefits, but the electricity itself is going into the grid locally and generally being used there.
Because I worked at GE for a while, and they built gearboxes up in Erie, and they were massive, but now they've moved to some other facility.
Yeah.
When you're making electricity with the thing, to me, it seems like there's too many variables. The speed of the windmill, what it generates, and then if you're going to sell it further away, you got to step it up for high voltage and transfer it. You know what I mean? I don't know if this is the way to go.
They've worked a lot of that out, so they know what they're doing. You see a lot of companies going with it, but there are a lot of things that have to be done to make sure that it is able to go out there on the grid and be at a stable level. Yeah.
The commercial ones in Pennsylvania, what's sort of like an average height of them? It seems like you're limited on how high you can go because of cranes and constructions. Is there a height limit that you can go in Pennsylvania?
Tower, the up to the nacelle, I'd say somewhere around maybe 400 feet. And then blade tips, I think of the one in Potter County, they're going to be somewhere, the blades will reach up to about 600 feet.
Is there any restrictions on how, put construction aside, that you're not allowed to go above a certain height because of air traffic?
Yeah, it would depend on the region. So that has to be reviewed. The FAA has a database and you can go in and look at where the position is going to be and they review that and they'll give you a yes, you can go forward, or no, you've got to stop or lower it. And they they'll review that process, and so there are certain locations where it's certainly off limits. Once you go above 200 feet, you have to have a light on top of it. That's kind of the other thing. But in general, I don't necessarily see restrictions beyond just like airports and things like that, or the local municipality saying we don't want them that high or whatever.
300 to 400 feet here worldwide, is that an average height?
Yeah, that's fairly. No, the technology's maybe getting a little higher, but there are a couple that are up there, but that's pretty typical.
737 might run into that.
Yeah, they put the lights on them, so at nighttime I can see them, and they're on aviation maps, so they can also see them on there, so they know they're there. Yes?
The construction made for high wind, has there ever been like a tornado, which is so much more than, or do they take that into account?
I'm not sure if anybody's like there to say, okay, the tornado is coming, let's stop it. The turbine itself can kind of sense if the wind speeds get too high and will automatically shut itself off. And I have seen videos of tornadoes going through them. Some of them, I mean, it depends on the speed if there's any damage or not. They can be damaged by wind. They're also lightning rods, so they occasionally get struck by lightning, and occasionally they'll lose a blade because of that. So whenever there's a lightning storm within, like, say, 30 miles, there are no technicians allowed to be up tower, so they get them down just for safety reasons.
I was in the military, and we did a lot of the transport stuff with helicopters. We had to be aware of static electricity buildup. do you have to deal with that being grounded or people getting in there?
I'm pretty sure they're grounded, but I can't speak to that any more than that. I know there are certain precautions and things that they go into when they're working with it. Yeah.
So they're probably not traveling as fast as the speed or probably
Yeah. I don't know. Interesting. Anybody else? All right then. Well, if you have anything else, feel free to come on up and let me know. So thank you.